Here and here. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back live with the Louis B. Free Radio Show, Brain Food from the Heartland. And I am delighted to be talking with Trevor Huskey this morning. Trevor, good morning to you.
Good morning, Louis.
I'm fascinated by your work, and I've been telling you this, and I'm blown away by it, I guess would be the best way. But let's first talk about you and tell us about yourself, if you would.
Okay. Yes, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been a social worker for 25 years. I worked in therapeutic day schools for 6 years down in Chicago. I've been a therapist for 17 years, and I've done 2 years of crisis counseling work. And I also do presentations at public libraries, universities, and mental health agencies regarding these different topics that we'll be talking about today.
Let's get into it a little more. Tell me why you chose that path for education.
Well, it was an interesting development. Actually, I was art undergrad, and I was following my bliss, and I was living in New York, and I was working at an art gallery. And about 3 years into the second round of living in New York, I said, this just isn't going to work out. And I was in a relationship, a very serious relationship, and I thought I've got to do something more with my life. And I started looking at psychology, and then my wife and I had some conversations, and I settled on social work because it's more applicable. I had thought of doing art therapy early on when I was undergrad, but I wanted to have more variety. And so I took some classes in social work and applied to some grad schools. And luckily, I got into my alma mater at UT Austin and just absolutely fell in love with it from day one. Just it really lined up with my values and my true nature. And there you go. So I've been hooked on it ever since. I've had the most amazing career, really. I've gotten so much more out of it than I ever expected.
It's wonderful. Trevor, let me ask you this. When you sound you were going to art therapy, you were considering art therapy and then doing what you're doing now. So obviously how do I want to say it's a great inner desire to help people.
Yeah, that's something that I came to connect with later on in life. And once I started down that social work field, like I said, I just really embraced it, and it became the guiding force in my life in so many different ways. And as a therapist, I just thrive on being in session with people and juggling the different kind of things that I have to keep in mind as I'm working with them and educating around things, pointing out patterns and themes in their work, in our work together, and then providing them with some just straightforward ways to help themselves cope and take more responsibility and ownership of their lives.
I know this is a difficult question to answer.
Sure.
Do you know where that comes from in Trevor Huskey, that desire to?
Oh, it was interesting when I applied to grad school. I wrote I wrote a paper along with my application, and I talked about when my family was living in Afghanistan. I was about 3 or 4 years old, and I remember seeing a beggar on the street, and he was missing a leg, and he was this very old guy, he's toothless, and I my heart just went out to him even at that young age. And I asked my dad if I could give him some money, and my dad gave me some money. And I remember walking over there and dropping the coins into his little bowl, and he just looked up at me and gave me the most beautiful, sweet smile. And that really resonated with me when I was thinking about my life and applying to grad school. And I was like, yeah, no, I think that's a very important part of me that has been overlooked to this point in time. And then there's the other aspect too of myself in terms of having struggled with anxiety throughout my lifetime. I've had to deal with anxiety in all the different forms possible, basically, except an eating disorder. And it's been tough, and it was punishing at times. And so I really understand it in a way I think that maybe some other clinicians who haven't had to go through all of that don't. And I really want to make sure that other people don't have to suffer unnecessarily, as I feel like I did.
That's wonderful. I appreciate that, because obviously a lot of empathy.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of tough things going on in this world, especially right now. We live in a very complicated time, and it's very involved. And it's just too much for most of us. Most people are struggling. The human condition in the first place is a tough deal.
Yeah.
But once again, the world that we're living, the man-made world that we're living in right now, is just off the rails, and we've really got to get our act together. And it's getting pretty late in the game for that, so we don't have a lot of time left to do that.
Trevor Huskey, I agree with you. I get very concerned. I see, I've said this a lot on the show. I've always been wonderful. I've not one. I haven't. I don't want to say I've been wonderfully, very, very optimistic. I've always kept a very optimistic view, and more and more, I struggle with maintaining optimism. I just don't. It's difficult when you look at the world around and what's going on.
It is. It's very tough. What has helped me deal with it the most is one, I've been able to learn how to really contend with or resolve my underlying trauma that I had to deal with in life. But the second part too is that I have my true nature, my values, and my priorities all lined up. And I talk to my patients about this. It's like having your spine in alignment. And if you don't have those three things in alignment, it's like your spine is out of alignment. And that can be very painful and challenging and a real struggle for people in life. So I've got all those set up, and I live by my values and my priorities and my true nature on a daily basis. And that just helps me navigate this really treacherous time in the world history. I don't have to contend with much anxiety at all these days. And I pretty much relatively sailed through the pandemic, like very few people did.
Very difficult for a lot of people. We're still hearing about the results of that. We're still hearing very tough stories about it. Again, I don't want to digress too much, but education, how kids are behind. How
Mm,
many, who knows? The whole education system. I don't want to say the whole education system, but I get concerned when I read statistics about what's going on in some schools, how kids, I've mentioned this a lot on the show, that there is a teacher that I know uh, that was telling me that teaches third and fourth grade, and said that she's got fourth graders that are reading at a kindergarten level. Well,
mm,
and the school, I reluctant to use the word forces her to pass them,
mm.
but they pass. I'll just for brevity, they go to the next grade. How do you ever catch up? If you're fourth grade, then you go to fifth grade and you're reading at, let's say, first grade level, you're never going to catch up. And that's very disturbing to me. And the
Yeah.
pandemic made that even worse.
Yeah, the pandemic just turned our world upside down, and we're still struggling with the fallout from that. Probably will be for years. And my heart really goes out to the younger generations having to contend with that. I'm very lucky. I grew up in a time when, you didn't have these social pressures. You didn't have to deal with the pandemic. You didn't have to deal with climate change. So, I mean, I feel like I got away scot-free basically growing up compared to the young people these days. And I do everything I can to try to once again make things better from my point of view, professionally and then personally too. I'm very big into the environment. I do a lot of recycling and things like that, to help minimize my carbon footprint. So once again, that's that value based living that's so important. And if you're locked in with that, it's a great deal.
It is a lot to deal with. When you, again, your approach, a number of things I want to talk about, but your approach to anxiety, tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, I have three different types of things that I work with people on at the very beginning. Number one is I would like to change their mindset. Why? Because most people view anxiety as this horrible, awful, nasty thing trying to ruin my life. And it's not that at all. And once we have a more open mindset regarding anxiety, that really makes a big difference in terms of how we approach it, how we deal with it, and how we contend with it on an ongoing basis. Um, so that's first, and part of that is so there's two main things that I really put on the table. First is that we're fully integrated creatures, physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, and that's per Dan Siegel. He's a brilliant professor of psychiatry out at UCLA. And then the second part is that we orient two main ways in life, and that one is externally, and our brains are focused on threats and opportunities, and then internally, and we're contending with our thoughts and our feelings. And what I share with people about the thoughts and the feelings is that they are not the enemy. I know that they're not easy to deal with at times. They can be overwhelming. They can seem weird and odd and all kinds of stuff, but they really are just trying to help us. And if we have this more, positive mindset regarding ourselves and how we're contending with things internally, that makes a world of difference to be able to once again deal with life on a regular basis. And the last thing is to just give them some straightforward techniques to work with. I do a lot of work with deep breathing, self-talk. Those are the two that really are most helpful. I have a few forms that I work with people on too, an anxiety thought pattern form, and then a character strength form as well. So those are the main things that I do in terms of working with people just in general. So once again, mindset is huge though.
When Trevor Huskey, when you think about the amount of anxiety and you read these suggestions that everyone should, I don't know why under 65 get tested for anxiety. I don't know what about us old people, but they talk about testing just about everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's fascinating because, anxiety is our number one mental health issue in our country. It used to be number two. Depression used to be number one. I don't think that was ever the case, though. I think anxiety has always been number one. I just think we understand it a lot better now and are able to recognize the symptoms more accurately. People are talking more openly about it. For a lot of people who struggle with anxiety, there's a real sense of guilt and shame and embarrassment around it, and they don't talk about it. And I have so many people who come into treatment and they say, you know what, this was really hard for me to come in today. And I'm like, yes, I'm sure it was. And you're being incredibly courageous by coming into treatment right now. We still have this stigma in mental health field, unfortunately, that, if you're dealing with anxiety, you're crazy, you're weak, it's a character flaw. That's not the case. Anxiety is a major component, a dominant component of the human condition. And it's been around forever. The Greek philosophers wrote extensively about it. And, so every generation feels like they're the most anxious generation for a variety of reasons. You have the Bay of Pigs and, the nuclear, once again, tests what was that again? When they hid under the desks in the schools back in the 50s.
Yeah. See,
So
you don't remember. I personally remember that.
yeah.
So
Yeah. And even the year, in 1999, they were Y2K, all these things,
Yeah.
so everybody, and people feed off of it all the time in very unhealthy ways. And we get these, bouts of moral panic where these groups end up like driving these major kind of events that are pretty tragic in reality. So there's all different kinds of stuff that's happening that indicates that anxiety is just prevalent, dominant, extensive, pervasive, and we just need to get on board in terms of how to deal with it properly. So yeah, getting tested, sure, I think that would be very helpful. We have some pretty accurate tests these days.
Yeah. That was
So
what I was going to ask you also. How do you test for that? So there are accurate tests.
there's the GAD-7, yep. And, that's a standard anxiety test that a lot of primary care physicians are using now. At the new agency that I'm working at, Everside Health, we screen for anxiety and depression each time somebody comes in.
I'm talking with Trevor Huskey, and again, we've got links up for the Breathtaking World of Anxiety, and or editions, the complete edition. You can get more information. They're at Amazon. We've got those links up at louisfreeshow.com, or look up Trevor Huskey at Amazon. when we again in defining and anxiety, and like you say, it's every generation has had their things. Again, for the word anxiety, I know for me, the older I get and the weirder I'm getting, some people don't think that could be possible, but it is. I wonder sometimes about word use. Am I using the right word? I mean, really, I'll look them up. In my 70th year, it's like now I'm starting to wonder if I'm using words correctly. And because a lot of people say, myself included, will say, I'm really anxious to see this or do that. And I substitute eager instead of anxious because
Mm-hmm.
the one seems to be a little more, they seem very different. Anxiety, and when people suffer from anxiety or have deep anxiety, it can be crippling, correct?
Sure, yeah, it can be devastating, and it manifests in so many different ways. It's unreal. Yeah, and there are more anxiety disorders than any other type of mental health disorder. And once again, they are extensive. Eating disorders, which aren't traditionally considered anxiety disorders by, I think, a lot of people, but they certainly are. We have OCD, we have generalized anxiety disorder, adjustment disorders. Then trauma too has traditionally been considered an anxiety disorder. So PTSD, that was developed through the military first as a diagnosis. It used to be called shell shock. Um, then we also have perfectionism. That's not a formal diagnosis, but it is a very prevalent one, and that manifests significantly with a lot of my patients. That's something that I keep an eye out for. There are 3 different types of perfectionism. Most people aren't aware of those different types. And anxiety can result in some pretty serious stuff. One of the more extensive ones, or one of the more challenging ones that I've written about in my book, is what I call emotional self-abuse. And that is some brutal stuff. People really just view the world as a very hostile place. They view themselves as very incompetent. Um, and they struggle immensely, and they're not able to appreciate good things that are around them nearly enough, and they can oftentimes mistake an opportunity for a threat, and that's really challenging then way to go through life when you're mistaking those types of things.
Yeah, that would be awful, I would think, as a threat. I want to say good morning to Maggie Magnostro in Florida, a wonderful author who's joining us. Ada Morales, good morning to you. And Jack, shop around the corner. Welcome to you. Again, I'm talking with Trevor Huskey, and we're talking about uh, breaking world of anxiety. It's so important. And I was telling Trevor before we went on how I've got so many things covered, and how much underlining I did. Lots of underlining in the intros to your books. When you say again the number one behavioral health issue, um, most people at some point in their life are dealing with some form of anxiety. Is that a fair?
Yes, I mean, anxiety is once again so common. And it's interesting because when I talk with my patients, one of the things I do is I provide some education about typical anxiety versus atypical anxiety. So, typical anxiety would be, say, public speaking. That's the number one quote unquote fear in life. And then, and then, uh, now, excuse me a second. Um, and then atypical anxiety would be, say, not being able to order food at a restaurant. I actually worked with a 12-year-old girl who had that symptom, so it was very interesting working with
Can't
her.
order.
Yeah,
Explain that, Trevor, if
yeah,
you
she
would.
wasn't able to order food at a restaurant. She just couldn't speak up for herself. And this was related to some problems at home. And once we were able to address those problems at home, that anxiety went away. She was able to order food at a restaurant. She actually got very good at advocating for herself. So it was a self-advocacy issue. This is one of the things I work with people on a lot. I work with people on communication, social skills, self-advocacy, conflict resolution. These are very important life skills. As I tell my patient or ask my patients, we have 2 basic skills in life: social skills and problem solving. Which one's more important? So what do you say, Louis?
You tell me.
I don't know. All I know is they're both really important and they're intertwined the vast majority of the time. So we're using both most of the time. And so it's a trick question, but it just goes to show how important, once again, the communication skills are. We're very social creatures. We can't live alone. We are dependent on other people. We always want or need something from somebody else every single day. And communication skills, self-advocacy skills, social skills are all very important in terms of making sure that that happens.
I'm talking with Trevor Huskey, and again, the breathtaking world of anxiety. Uh, the tipping point, if you will, to decide to put, again, old guy, I'm going to say pen to paper. I know people don't. Well, most people don't. But when you decided to write these, what was it?
Oh, yeah, no, that was, about 12 years ago. I had been specializing in anxiety, so I've been specializing in anxiety as a therapist for about 12 years, and when I started focusing on anxiety, I was just fascinated by it. It is the most fascinating topic in the world as far as I'm concerned, endlessly so. It's really amazing stuff. I could tell you story after story after story, just truly compelling scenarios. And as I was working with people, I just found myself taking notes and notes and notes on an ongoing basis, and just percolating on this stuff after work, and wondering about things and practicing new ways of approaching. And yeah, and once again, it's an issue that I had to contend with in my life for so long. I had vested interest in doing so. And then after about 2 or 3 years of all that percolating and note taking and pondering, I thought, hey, you know what? I think I've got something here. And so I started working on a draft, and then I probably have gone through about 10 drafts before I finally finished with it this summer here. It was a very arduous undertaking. I was very committed to the process. I spent thousands of hours researching, writing about it, and finally finished it, and to great relief too. It was it was a long time coming, and I'm just very pleased that I have finalized the project, and look forward to being able to hopefully utilize this material in schools one day. I would like to do some program development in junior high, high schools, colleges, and to be able to get to people early on, teach them this information, these skills, so that they don't have to once again suffer unnecessarily for extended period of time. Because what happens is people tend to gravitate towards these poor coping skills, and then they get reinforced year after year, sometimes decade after decade, and then it takes so much more work to undo all of that and to get going on the right path.
So if you're, and maybe this is a bad analogy, but uh, if you're going somewhere and if you have a map, I know people are going to say I'm an old guy. People don't use maps anymore. But if you know where you're going, it's easy. If you don't, like you say, at the time, what you'll be lost somewhere. So if you give them the tools, in this
Yep.
case, saying a map up front, then it's
Mhm.
easier to navigate. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yeah. So my books are broken down into three different books. So I have the first one talks about basically what is anxiety, what it isn't, and it has 12 chapters in it. The second one is about the human condition. That one has 14 chapters, and that is material that everybody really needs to understand. The first one is on the brain versus the mind. The second one is on attachment, a very, very important topic that has been really written about extensively. It had been ignored for years, decades, for quite a bit, but it's really back in vogue and very so relevant. The third chapter is on temperament, character, personality. And then the fourth one's on the self. Then we have social dynamics, social skills, communication, self-advocacy is number 6. And then mindset, defense mechanism, cognitive errors, number 7. Then I talk about contemporary society, schools, work and performance, men, women, and then death and religion. So it's got, once again, the main topics that I consider to be most relevant in relation to anxiety in general. And it's very important information for everybody to get on board with. Once again, it's pretty straightforward. It's just there's a lot of it.
A lot of it, yeah. A comment, Meg Nasra said the worst part of anxiety is living with others who do not understand it. it causes shame. Speaking up for oneself is a life changer. Any thoughts?
True. Yeah. This is once again that stigma that is still being applied to anxiety. If you're anxious, you're weak, and that's really unfortunate. Part of this is the American mindset. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that Western mentality. If you're not a winner, you're a loser. Kind of, it's pretty harsh landscape here in many ways. Especially regarding mental health issues. And anxiety is not a character flaw. Despite how some people might regard it so, it is just not the case. Um, there's 5 different sources of anxiety. So if you don't
Talk
mind, I'll
about it.
go over those
Yeah,
now.
please.
Okay? So,
Sorry to interrupt. Go
so
ahead.
the first one is physiological. Okay. Now, the main one regarding that is temperament. We're born with our temperament. There's 9 traits of temperament, and we vary on the scale for each temperament trait. And for people who are on the sensitive, there's a sensitive temperament trait, and people who are more on that sensitive trait, they are the ones who tend to struggle with anxiety more, just once again from an inherent standpoint. This is a lifelong issue then for them. So I'm a highly sensitive person myself, and it took me a while to get on board with that. But once I did, it was really a huge change for me and helped me be able to contend with it a lot better. The second type of physiological is medical issues. Now, these don't trigger anxiety per se, but they trigger very similar symptoms to anxiety as far as I'm concerned. So we have, heart issues, we have diabetes, blood sugar issues, anemia, thyroid, what's the other one? Postpartum, actually, there's postpartum anxiety, which not a lot of people know about, and then dehydration. There's one other one I can't think of it right now off the top of my head, but so that's the physiological. Then we have trauma. Now, trauma is a bear. It's really so much more extensive of a factor for people than most people can even imagine. We have different types of trauma. One is physical trauma. Then we have emotional trauma. We can have other types of trauma too, spiritual trauma, etc. But the main 2 that we really look at is the physical and the emotional. Now, the physical is easier to wrap our heads around. Why? Somebody abused me physically. Okay, that's a straightforward right and wrong pretty much most of the time. But emotional trauma is very challenging. Why? Because people tend to dismiss it. Oh, it wasn't that big of a deal. Oh, that happens to everybody. Oh, they didn't mean anything by it. But at the time, it's
Awful, right?
very powerful for most of us. Yeah. And then what happens, it sinks into the groundwater, so to speak, in our psyche. And unless we've once again done some work to reconcile with that trauma, it's going to be active. And it can dominate our mindset. And the main ways that trauma manifests is as anxiety and depression. And so we have different forms of trauma too. We have primary trauma, so that's happening to you. Secondary trauma, which is happening to somebody else, but we've either witnessed it or witnessed the outcome of it. So like a lot of law enforcement officers, and then people who work in like the ER or firefighters have to contend with secondary trauma. And but there's a real bravado in those industries, and they tend to minimize it and dismiss it. But I've worked with a number of people who've struggled with it over the years. That's why there's a lot of alcoholism in those, or can be in those fields. Then there is what I call tertiary trauma. And so I'm using the old art school information here. You have primary, secondary, tertiary colors. So tertiary is if we just hear about it. So I haven't witnessed it. It didn't happen to me, but I just hear about it. That's very subtle stuff. And when people get triggered by that kind of traumatic event, um, or that kind of event results in trauma for them on some level, it really speaks to the highly sensitive nature that they have. I worked with one individual who just heard 3 things happening, on a radio station, in a conversation, in another situation, and it resulted in these very powerful, intrusive thoughts, suicidality, of hurting other people, and so forth. And it really spoke to his gentle nature. So the trauma stuff can be very fine tuned. We can have institutional trauma too, when our institutions aren't supporting us in the proper ways. Racism certainly can be part of that. We have developmental trauma, that's like ongoing trauma, where people struggling year after year with these kind of situations, living in a war zone, or poverty, which can be like living in a war zone for people. So that's truly extensive. Bruce Perry said that trauma is the epidemic of our lifetime right now. So that's what we're dealing with, is this epidemic of trauma. Third is lifestyle. So we have sleep, exercise, diet, socialization. Once again, we got that social component that Dan Siegel talked about, which a lot of people dismiss as being not as important as it truly is, although the pandemic really showed us how important socializing is. Then we have other things too, such as media. Are we watching violent sports? MMA. I stopped watching MMA because that would trigger these very strong anxiety responses physically for me. Football still can be, once again, a violent sport, quite so. Then are we watching like gruesome, gory movies? Like some of my patients do that right before bed. I'm like, that's not a good idea. Because once again, that's sinking into your subconscious, and your subconscious is going to be grinding away on that over the night. And then we have things like violent video games, even newscasts, because they pump you up with all that fear mongering. And then good luck trying to get to bed after that, or get to sleep after that. So that's the lifestyle. Disorganization can cause problems. It doesn't trigger anxiety per se, but it stresses you out. And if you're prone to anxiety, it can trigger the anxiety, exacerbate it. So I'll talk openly with my patients about that one. The fourth one is insecurity. Now, all of us are insecure about something in life, and that's just part of the human condition. A lot of people, though, they do things to avoid their insecurities as much as possible. They hide them, and then that, once again, it magnifies this sense of shame around them. So we want to talk openly about our insecurities with people under the right conditions. We want to choose carefully, who are we talking about? Who is this person? Can I trust them, and to what degree? Excuse me. When we deal with our insecurities directly, we become stronger people. And that's a good thing. There's a famous quote by Carl Jung. He said, "We don't so much solve our problems as we grow and develop the capacity, or we develop the capacity to outgrow them." And I love that quote a lot. So, and that's one of my main mindsets in life. Then the fifth one is ambivalence. Now, there's different forms of ambivalence. Most people aren't familiar with ambivalence. When I ask my patients what is ambivalence, most people talk about apathy instead. So ambivalence is when I'm conflicted. So my aunt is in the hospital. She's seriously ill. And okay, I should go see her because she's been a wonderful aunt. But hey, my friends are all going to this wonderful concert. It's my friend's birthday. We're going to have a great time. What should I do? I don't know. My aunt might not make it, but I don't want to miss out on this great event with my friends. That's ambivalence. That's a conscious form of ambivalence. Then we have what's called cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is subconscious conflict. And a lot of people aren't aware of their subconscious conflicts. And these oftentimes are really driven by these strong beliefs we have in life, about, the world is a fair place. Well, good luck with that one, That's not going to work out very well for you, because any kind of unfairness in life, then you're going to find very frustrating, anxiety provoking, possibly anger provoking. So we have to be very careful about our fundamental beliefs in life. And now the cognitive dissonance, that can result in what's called free-floating anxiety, when we get anxious, but we can't figure out why. And it is, once again, this underlying turbulence, basically, that we're experiencing. I had a very interesting case one time. I had a patient of mine who had a panic attack at Summerfest, this big music festival here. And we were talking about it. And after a good 10 minutes or so, we figured out that it didn't have anything to do with Summerfest itself. It had to do with her ex-abusive boyfriend. So there you go. So it can be all kinds of stuff. It's interesting.
So that somehow the Summerfest brought up that.
Well, her ex-boyfriend had been emotionally abusive. He had blamed her for everything, told her she was a bad person, et cetera, et cetera. And this stuff had just been percolating in her subconscious. She had never really reconciled with it. And so at Summerfest, for whatever reason, there was some kind of trigger, probably, I'm not sure exactly what it was. And she was thinking that everybody else was thinking that she was a bad person and that she was a loser and she was at fault for everything. So, and that's what triggered the panic attack. Once we talked about that and talked about the boyfriend more, then that was able to help resolve that issue. She still had other types of anxiety. There was a lot in the family. I actually had worked with her brother too, whether her parents struggled with anxiety. So she had this anxious nature. And, being able to resolve one aspect of her anxiety, that particular issue, wasn't necessarily going to minimize the anxiety in other forms. She was struggling at work with it. There was some anxiety in relation to her current relationship as well. So once again, it can be pretty prevalent.
Again, and your book's available at Amazon, The Breaking World of Anxiety, The
Yeah, the
Breathtaking
breathtaking world of
World
anxiety.
of
It is truly
Anxiety.
breathtaking. There is
Yeah,
no doubt about it.
yeah, absolutely. And again, I love speaking with you and certainly talking about this, but a couple of other things, when you were talking about trauma, and again, you're the expert, you're the professional. I'm not. I know my experience, but you have the expertise. I've talked about being abused very openly when I was
Mhm.
a child, and when the way I say it is, and I have to do air quotes that no one's going to see. You deal with it. That's the air quotes. It or it
Mhm.
will deal with you. Um, to get, I guess, the upper hand, control, whatever, deal with it from the anxiety. If you don't get help, if you don't reach out, if you don't find tools to use, it is, it might make any sense. It's gonna
Yeah.
probably it's
Yes.
gonna be in control instead of you.
I get you totally. Now, the thing we know about trauma, what happens is we need to reconcile with it. We can't change the past,
Or,
but as adults, we can change our relationship with the past. And that's one of the real powerful things about being an adult. We don't have to let our traumatic past dominate us. We can come to, once again, much better terms with it. So I'll give you a couple of examples, one personal and one professional. So for me, I was bullied as a child a lot. I was a small kid. I was thin and I was anxious. So the perfect trifecta to be a target for bullies in school. Now, when I was a little bit older, I always thought to myself, why didn't I fight back? And I blamed myself for not fighting back. And so then I was beating up on myself on top of it, and that's just not fair to myself. And then one day I thought about it, and I thought, no matter what other people did to me, I always went back to school the next day.
yeah,
And
that's
I was
great.
like, wow, I was so much stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. And that was a really pivotal moment for me in life. I was able to recognize that I did have this inner strength that I just hadn't been able to give myself credit for before. And that was very, very powerful. Then now I had this one patient too, who I worked with, who came in and he presented with two different types of things that he was contending with. Um, One was that he had to sit with his back to the wall in a restaurant. And the other one was that when he and his wife went on vacation, that they would go up to like a scenic overlook. And if people were standing, he would be even like 100 feet away from the scenic overlook. And if people were standing near the overlook, he would have a panic attack and he would become physically debilitated from that panic attack. He couldn't walk. He would be hobbled. And this speaks to what happens with anxiety, with these traumatic events. What happens is the anxiety just keeps getting louder and louder and louder until you pay attention to it and deal with it. Because the anxiety is not the problem. Anxiety is a signal. So, real quick question for you, Louis. What is the purpose of physical pain?
To let you know to deal with it.
There's something wrong and it needs to be dealt with. Anxiety is that too. It is a signal. It is saying there's something wrong and you need to deal with it. And so for him, what I did was I was like, okay, well, the situation in the restaurant, in my mind, that was an easy one. I was like, okay, so did anybody ever, come up, attack you from behind? Anything bad happen? He's like, no. I was like, are you sure? He's like, no. I was like, are you positive? Like, tell me anything happened in childhood. And he's like, oh, wait, yeah, I got jumped 3 different, at first he's like 1 time. And then I was like, and then he said, oh, and then a second time. And then, oh, a third time. Yeah, no, I got jumped 3 times from behind growing up. And I was like, yeah, so then that's something that, your brain is held on to and said, you know what, we don't trust that people aren't going to attack us from behind if we're, not paying attention to what's going on behind us. So once we talked about that, then within a week, he was able to sit at a restaurant without having to have his back to the wall. The second one was a little bit more challenging. That was a little bit more indirect. I was very curious about that one because I'd never heard that kind of symptoms before. And so we took a look at his background, and he said, well, actually, when I was growing up, my dad was very emotionally abusive. And we came to consider the fact that maybe his dad was struggling with bipolar and did so very poorly, as a lot of people did back in the day. And his dad would throw these huge fits and be very emotionally abusive to people. And my patient, being the oldest child and male, would intercede. He felt the need to intercede and take on the responsibility to make sure everybody else was safe. Hear that? Make
Wow.
sure that everybody else is safe, just like people by the edge of the outlook there. And he had never dealt with that trauma. And it was an ongoing trauma. This happened for years and years and years growing up. And he had to bear the brunt more and more as he got older. And so we talked about that. We talked about the possibility of his dad having bipolar. Um, and, he was able to really reconcile with that stuff very quickly. This was 6 sessions. And then he said, you know what, I'm done. I'm good. And so it was a fascinating experience for me working with him. And these types of things happen all the time. It's just like I said, just endlessly fascinating, the kind of scenarios that I work with people on.
I want a couple of quick questions. I know we're getting close to the bottom of the hour. The Breathtaking World of Anxiety. I'm talking with Trevor Huskey, and we've got links up. Just go to look them up on Amazon and you'll find it. When you mentioned bullying, we hear about bullying. And again, I was bullied. I think many, if not most people, have had an experience like that when they were kids. And we hear now, that there was actually not far from where I am now, a young girl took a gun to school. She was tired of being bullied, and you
Yep.
hear this a lot with bullying and
Mm,
kids taking guns to school or threatening or whatever.
mhm.
And again, I'm not justifying the bully's behavior, but that's got to be, if they're doing that, there must be something going on with them where they were hurt or
Yeah.
something. I mean, what makes the bully bully?
Yeah, and oftentimes that does happen. They've been bullied at home, or they've been modeled. The behavior has been modeled in some other way at home. Whether it's talking badly about other people, whether it's like racist rants or such. And so once again, parents have a very big influence on their children, and the type of environment that they create at home certainly is going to influence their children quite a bit, um, and that plays out at school. So,
When,
and that's
when
something
you,
that I had to reconcile too, with my own bullying. I had to remind myself, well, they were struggling with their own issues in life, and
that
this,
doesn't justify. I know you're not saying that, but it doesn't justify their behaviors
yeah.
because someone hurt you or whatever doesn't justify you hurting someone else.
Yeah, but at least I want to put it in context for
Yeah,
myself. Once again,
understand.
we have to be careful when we reconcile with the trauma from the past, because oftentimes there are parents involved with the traumatic stuff that people have to contend with. And a lot of my patients go, well, I love my parents and I don't want to, I don't want to blame them. That's like, we don't necessarily have to blame anybody here. It's what happened and how did that affect me? Those are the two things that we have to really address when we're dealing with working on reconciling our trauma from the past. I have my patients journal around this kind of stuff. So, see what you can come up with. And it's very interesting how that plays out with people. Sometimes they can they can have things resolved very quickly. I had one guy who had a traumatic experience on a cruise, a medical issue. He ended up in the hospital. He did journaling around it one time, and he came back and he's like, "Yep, no, I own my story. It's part of me, and you know what? I've been able to come to terms with it, and I'm good with that one." And so it's really excellent stuff.
Talking with Trevor Huskey. One more quick question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Again, and I certainly would like to have a few more opportunities to talk with you on here, because there's so many, and you saw my notes, my
Yeah.
chaos here with my notes, that I said before I didn't get to most of them. But I've got to ask you about social media
Yeah.
today. With anxiety, bullying, etc. Your thoughts on social media. I'll make it very broad.
Technology is a wonderful tool. It's amazing. It broadens the scope of life for people in so many different ways. It's helpful with healthcare, entertainment, all different kinds of stuff. At the end of the day, it's still just a tool, and we all have to be very cognizant of how we're using this tool. Making sure that we're using things intentionally as opposed to compulsively. One of the main ways that anxiety manifests is through compulsive behavior, whether that's eating, shopping, gambling, substance abuse, all different kinds of stuff. Excuse me. Social media can be part of that too, this compulsive use of social media. Um, Young people are indoctrinated into it, in my opinion, probably much too early. I know when my boys were younger, we didn't get them cell phones until they were 12. I think that's a reasonable age to get a child a cell phone. So there are things that parents can do to once again structure things properly around the use of this. They can, monitor within reason, once again, their use of this material. They can make sure that cell phones are off before going to bed. We don't want kids using cell phones in the middle of the night. Being on social media at 2 in the morning is just not going to be healthy for you. So parents really have a big role to play in this, and it's not fun and it's not easy, because this can end up being a real battleground with younger people who are digital natives, is the term.
Oh,
They
is that?
view
I don't think I ever heard that. That's great. That's great.
digital natives, yeah, so it's such a, and they view technology as a birthright, and who wouldn't in this time, this day
Sure.
and age, and, I get that, but it's once again, at the end of the day, parents still have a responsibility to manage the household properly. Sometimes I've worked with parents and they're like, "Oh, there's nothing I can do about this." I'm like,
Yeah,
"No, there's always
please.
something you can
Yeah.
do." Once again, how well it's gonna play out is another matter. So, there's a really great parenting program called Love and Logic. Highly recommend that to anybody. So very much in keeping with how I approach parenting and the things that I recommend to parents.
Again, when you're saying about getting up, or going online at 2 o'clock in the morning on their phone, they're again, you're the expert here, but anxiety, they've got to know, they've got to see what's there. And of course, with the algorithms, and that's a whole other
Yeah.
topic, sending them more and more of what they click on.
And the hard part with compulsive behavior is, we fall into these traps very easily. We think this is healthy for us, but it's not. So one of the important things that I talk with my patients about is, when can you trust yourself and when can't you trust yourself?
That's
and and
interesting.
for young people, this is a very important concept to start embracing. And like I said, hopefully, junior high, high school, people are getting on board with this kind of stuff, because it's very important. Compulsive behavior is a form of avoidance. It doesn't get to the root of the problem, and it generally only makes things much worse, especially over time.
I love talking with you, Trevor Huskey, and there's so much,
Ah,
again, so much more I'd like to talk about if you'll continue with me. But again, tell us about the Amazon. Tell us a little bit about the availability of your books, The Breathtaking World of Anxiety.
Sure, yeah. So I have three different volumes, and so volume one, and once again, that covers anxiety, what it is, what it isn't. I talk about the difference between fear and anxiety. There's a very big difference there. Anxiety versus worry, anxiety and stress, anxiety and depression, how normal, the manifestations, the different types of diagnoses. Second volume talks about the human condition, all those different topics that I talked about earlier. And then the third volume is about treatment. And, I start off with healthy lifestyle. Second chapter is about awareness, acceptance, and ownership, an incredibly important concept regarding anxiety. This is mindset. This makes a huge difference in terms of people being able to contend with it effectively. Deep breathing, one of the most effective initial type of interventions that people can use. Self-talk, that's the money. That's the money shot right there. That's what people really need to get on board with, and it's amazing when people do. Um, then I talk about effective versus compromised coping skills. And we have to be very conscious about how we're contending with anxiety because these compromised coping skills, yes, they can help in the moment, but once again, they really aren't effective long term. Talk about treatment, medications. Not a big fan of medications in generally, unless they're absolutely necessary, but they're overprescribed way too much. Benzos are very dangerous medications, highly addictive, very hard on the brain. So you better be very careful with the benzos.
The benzodiazepine, like, I don't know
Yeah,
if they still,
Xanax,
Valium.
Xanax and
Oh,
such,
Xanax.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Valium was, right?
yep,
Valium.
uh-huh,
Yeah.
yep,
I don't
yeah,
even know if they still make that. I'm
yeah.
guessing there's still Valium out there. I don't know. I don't know.
They've got tons of medications these days,
And
and
that it kind
they're
of,
not shy about putting them on the table early.
and again, I don't, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a physician. But again, it's more masking the issue.
Mhm,
I mean, and there may be some brain chemistry, again, I don't know.
yep, yeah, in the more
Again,
severe
the
cases,
easy thing is to give a prescription. We'll take
yeah,
this. You feel better. If you don't feel, we'll add another one or raise the
yep,
dose, whatever.
yep, yep. And then the other thing that's very interesting about the medications is when you're taking medications, what kind of message are you sending to yourself about your anxiety? I can't handle it. When in
Mhm.
fact, the vast majority of the time people can. And so it really does,
Beautiful. I
as
love
far as
that.
I'm concerned, send the wrong message. And once again, this is kind of this more fundamental kind of approach that makes a really big difference. A fair amount of my patients are able to reduce or get off their medications, and
That's
it's
wonderful.
awesome. Yes, it is.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Trevor Huskey, I love this. You'll schedule with me, hopefully.
Excellent. Yeah,
I
no, I'd love
really,
to.
really want to continue the discussion because again, it's so important because again, when you look at the numbers, et cetera, uh,
Cool.
everybody at some point, I think, is dealing with some
Oh yeah.
level of anxiety. Again, the breathtaking world of anxiety. Trevor Huskey, my guest. Let's do it again soon, please.
Oh, I'd love to, Louis. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate this
Thank
opportunity.
you. Thank you. It's so interesting, ladies and gentlemen, and it's so important. And the more I read into what Trevor Husky's work is and understand, and you hear him. I mean, you hear the level, the depth of his work. And again, the idea, again, if you're able to, when he said about getting people off medication, think about how vitally important